Welcome everyone to the sixth and final webinar in our Winning Work in Major Projects series. My name is Anthony Holsworth, Business Facilitator with Austmine, and I'll be hosting today's live hour-long session. The webinar series is a collaboration between Austmine and the Federal Government's Entrepreneurs Program, which is administered by the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. So today's topic, Taking It Global, is a natural progression from the previous webinars that we've done that addressed what is required to win work in the major project environment in Australia. If you've developed the capability and capacity to operate competitively in the domestic market, then looking at offshore opportunities might be the next logical step. Certainly I know a lot of companies that have developed capability and capacity on some major projects in Australia and have then quite successfully ventured into offshore opportunities. As with the other webinars, you're encouraged to ask questions at the end via the Q&A facility on the left of your screen. And as usual, a recording of the webinar will be available via the Austmine website, as will a copy of these slides and a 10-question diagnostic on today's topic. Also, because this is the last webinar in the series, we're very, very keen to get your feedback on your impression of how the series has gone. So if you'd like to see more of this type of thing, then please keep an eye out for the email requesting your feedback in the next day or two. As with all of the webinars in this series, our experienced industry panel will be sharing their practical insights and hard-won lessons learned. We've got a great panel today with a really deep level of offshore experience. So let me introduce them. First off, we've got Jeff Elliott, Managing Director of CSA Global. CSA Global is an internationally regarded mining consulting company. It's headquartered in Perth with offices across the globe. Jeff completed his geology degree at Curtin University in the early 1990s and followed this with varied mining exploration, corporate and consulting roles over the next 25 years. These roles have seen him travel throughout Australia, Asia, the Americas, Africa and Europe. He's been involved with the startup and growth of several companies in the exploration and mining industry. For the last decade and a half, his focus has been on the growth of CSA Global, from a very small Perth-based company to one of the leading mining consultants globally. CSA Global generates a significant share of its revenue from export earnings, and Jeff is looking forward to sharing some of his experiences around entering and developing international markets. So Jeff's going to provide an insight into the life of an exporter, and not just any exporter, he's a services-based exporter as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. Second panelist is Paul Rigo. You might remember Paul from, I think, our first webinar in this series. Paul's the head of commercial for rail for Adani Australia. He holds a Bachelor of Law from Queensland University of Technology and has 17 years of commercial and legal experience, both in private practice and large corporate environments. Paul's worked on multi-million, in fact, billion-dollar projects in the oil and gas, resources and engineering industries. Some of these have included the Constancia copper project in Peru, the CAGR gold projects in Saudi Arabia, the Aktogay and Bozshakal greenfield copper projects in Kazakhstan, Matabi greenfield copper and gold mine in Indonesia, the Kinsevere greenfield copper mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So what Paul brings to the conversation is a procurement point of view, so procurement in offshore projects. The final panelist is Chris Gibbs-Stewart. Chris is the CEO of Austmine, Austmine being the leading industry body representing the Australian mining equipment, technology and services sector. She has some 30 years of experience in international business, industry development and general management. As the CEO of Austmine, Chris is firmly focused on delivering value to the organisation's members, creating opportunities and driving strategic innovation and collaboration across the industry. She's forged powerful relationships and has helped to significantly raise the profile of the sector to the point that it is now recognised as a federal government industry growth centre. I'd just like to acknowledge Mets Ignited as being the name and the driver of that growth centre. So we're going to be talking about sector profile shortly. So in 2016, for Chris's efforts in showcasing the Met sector, she was recognised for her work by winning the Industry Advocacy Award at the Australian Women in Industry Awards. She's held a swag of previous positions involving export, including International Business Manager for Marcel International, Managing Director of the Australia Ohio Office, General Manager of Australian Business International Trade Services, Marketing and Sales Manager for GeoNex International, just to name a few. She was also previously a Director for the Australian Latin American Business Council and has served on several government boards and export and industry development committees and councils. So a very well credentialed panel. Just briefly on myself, relating to the topic today, I've had nearly 7 years in an export advisory role in the past, so working with Austrade and Trade and Investment Queensland. In that time, predominantly working with companies that were pretty new to export and helping them through the journey. Look, essentially, this is what we're going to cover today. We've only got an hour, so we're pretty limited in what we can cover. But we're going to look at the industry generally. We're going to look at some of the strengths the industry offers in the global marketplace. We'll talk about some of the potential markets, some of the countries that are offering opportunities at the moment. And then really, I think this is the nuts and bolts of it. We're going to talk about how you can assess your export readiness. And, if you are considering export, what you need to do to determine it's the right decision. As part of that, we're going to talk about developing your export strategy. We're going to talk about market and opportunity assessment, and then we're going to wrap up by talking about sources of assistance and information. So just setting the scene. So there's a couple of dot points there just on the mining equipment technology and services, MET sector. Broadly. So as you can see, $90 billion in revenue annually total, employs 386,000 people, considerable R&D expenditure. So as you can see there, the yearly exports from our sector are around the $15 billion mark. So about a sixth of the revenue that the sector generates is derived from export. And as the last dot point mentions there, operating in pretty much every corner of the globe. Chris, can I please start with you first up? So, as we said before, a key role of Austmine is to help create a more competitive Australian MET sector and position this sector on the world stage. Can you talk to us about why you think Australian companies supplying mining equipment, technology and services are finding favour around the world?
Thanks, Anthony, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I guess really simply put is that we have a world-class reputation in mining. We're known for our best practice, innovation, and technical skills. We're also world leader in many mining niches. And because of that, we provide equipment, technology, and services that others don't. And really, our most successful companies have a focus on value and return in such areas as cost savings, increased productivity, and safety. And all this can be demonstrated, and our companies have a track record of this. And if you think about it, METS is really one of the only industries here in Australia where being from Australia is a hallmark of success and opens a lot of doors.
Thanks, Chris. So the stage is set for Australian companies that are considering export by the reputation the industry already has. So certainly it's the envy of a lot of other industries for its penetration into value chains worldwide. Paul, if I could call on you, you've worked in procurement roles in many locations around the world, no doubt dealing with suppliers from a range of countries. Generally speaking, how do our companies stack up against what's on offer from other parts of the world?
Thanks, Anthony, and welcome everyone. Second Chris's comments, the MET sector and more globally the Australian mining sector is internationally considered best practice. And what a lot of our MET suppliers have is that they're used to dealing with sophisticated commercial clients here in Australia, whether they be junior resource companies or the multinationals, but they're also quite adept at looking at innovative solutions, whether that's from a technology or from a commercial perspective. And that puts us ahead of the pack of a lot of our global competitors.
Thanks, Paul. Jeff, if I could call on you. So CSA Global no doubt competes with other consulting companies from around the world, and based on what Chris and Paul are saying there, is that what you're seeing with regard to your own business?
Look, yes, it is. I think the most important thing about competing with other companies is having an internationally recognised brand and an ability to provide service globally. So you need to consider your marketing strategy clearly about the export markets you're considering, and also operational matters about how you're going to service those, the development of those export markets.
Thanks, Jeff. I just want to bring up the next slide, which has a comment from Simi Maker, the CEO and Managing Director of Auzenco. So what he says is the remoteness and harshness of our projects gives us the opportunity to gain experience which we can take into very difficult and harsh environments around the world. I'll throw this question to the panel. You know, is the Australian environment that METS companies are operating in the good testing ground? Is it the testing ground that does allow us to set us apart on the world stage? You know, I was at an event a few weeks ago, and we were talking about operating in Australia, and the comment was that it's a good place to break things and of course fix them and come up with innovative ways to fix them. So I'll throw this to each of the panel. The Australian MET sector has a reputation in key offshore markets for problem solving and best practice. How can individual firms capitalise on this? Are we telling our story strongly enough, do you think?
It's Jeffrey. I might answer first if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I think just reflecting on one of your comments first about Australia being a great testing ground, it is, but it's not for everything. You know, for alpine mining conditions or Arctic mining conditions, we just don't have the climate for it. So in things that aren't climate-based and so on, then that's fine. And for climate-based things, then we do have the arid, we have the remote. We do, in some places, have the terrain, and we've got some tropical. But look, I think the best thing for the Australian market, Australian MET sector, to use their reputation to develop offshore markets is the best way is by promoting your wins through as many marketing channels as possible. And what you're looking for is what's your value proposition and how you've added value and created a competitive advantage to a client, wherever it may be, to then help you get more business in an export market. I believe case studies that have some type of client comment and identify the problem and the solution in a really succinct way, and then put that on your website. Use as much social media as you can to get that out. Be prepared to get your people to talk at conferences and seminars, again, talking about specific project case studies and how they've made a difference. Be a thought leader in the media, and ask your clients for referrals, because it's the best way to get business.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff. Can I just ask, just pick up you mentioned thorough use of social media channels. Is there a particular social media channel that's more effective?
Look, we use LinkedIn and Twitter as our main two. We don't tend to use Facebook as much. There's a lot of different media channels, and I guess again, your marketing strategy, your social media marketing strategy needs to be aligned to the region, because, for example, in China they don't use LinkedIn. You know, and in Russia they've got a different professional network social media site, and until recently there was a ban on LinkedIn. It's back up working in Russia at the moment. So don't just assume that the social media that we use here in the West is what people use in the market that you are developing. Do some research, speak to some people who know the best channels to communicate your story.
Thanks, Jeff. Paul, if I can ask you, you're on the receiving end, in a procurement role within offshore projects. Can you just comment on how well Australians are communicating their, their value proposition? That's a general question.
I think as a general rule, quite well. I think some of the traps for sort of new players is that even a simple thing, if you're doing work in a Spanish-speaking country in Latin America, for example, do your value prop and your case studies in both English and Spanish. You'll find that most people speak English, but just going that extra effort of doing it in both languages just creates a really good impression. And look, I worked with Zimmy for a number of years, and he's been extremely successful employing a number of the strategies that Jeff's outlined. And I think the thing that sort of characterised Zimmy was that don't be afraid to look at different markets. Do your research, and then once you've done that, then make a calculated decision about going after it. And you can even look at some of the other sort of players in that space. Calibre did a lot of work in Africa off the back of the work they did for Rio Tinto and BHP in the West. So actually going with your existing Australian customers into new markets can be a very good springboard.
Yeah, that's a great bit of advice to leverage off past successes into the next market is absolute golden advice. Chris, do you have anything to add on that last slide?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with what Jeff and Paul are saying. I really like the thought leadership piece as well as, using social media. But a couple other things. First, I think it's really important for companies to take advantage of major Australian promotions or missions offshore, where you can be showcased with other Australian firms. Second, it's really good to have an understanding of who is supplying where, so you can potentially leverage what is already being done offshore for your own company. And then it's really about tapping into the knowledge of those who have been there and done that to learn as much as you can about what they are doing and what makes them successful, and possibly go down that same path with your strategies.
Have you found, Chris, that people are willing to share their experiences as they've developed their business offshore?
Absolutely. I mean, we have Jeff on the phone today who's sharing his experience. And I think that companies are certainly willing to talk about both what they have done right and what they have done wrong. I've seen it in many, many cases.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think that there is a really strong abundance mentality in the Australian business community, and it's one of the most untapped things. If you ask the question, it's quite likely you'll get a very detailed response. And as Chris said, the lessons learned, in particular the things that didn't work, when people are prepared to talk about what didn't work, that can be absolutely invaluable. Chris, I might just get you to address the next topic as well before I go to Paul and Jeff. Industry strengths. So there's opportunity offshore for Australian METS companies, but where are our strengths? Do we have particular strengths, or is it across the board or throughout the supply chain, do you think? Chris?
Well, yep, I'm here. I think we have strengths across the supply chain, certainly, and where the opportunities lie really depends on the country. Some of the things that I think we really do well where we're seeing opportunities offshore include areas such as maintenance or just general refurbishments, and refurbishments in a more innovative way than what was being done in the past. As we know, there's not been a lot of expenditure over the last few years, particularly in CapEx, which means that right now a lot of work needs to be done getting equipment up to scratch and really maximizing what that equipment is doing. And this includes in such areas as plants with materials handling and really with all sorts of systems. I think also where we really excel is in the software and advanced technologies areas. And what we're seeing is mining companies who really need to connect things together. They have a lot of disparate systems, and they're trying to consolidate and integrate those systems which we have, and they're looking for expertise and someone to show them how to do that. Lastly, we have a great reputation in safety and the environment, and so I think there's a lot of opportunities out there in that field. Preventing injury, safety training, and just generally reducing impact on the surroundings. And an example of that would be tailings and tailings dam, and making those safer and better structured for the mining companies. Anthony, are you there?
Sorry, I've just pulled up the mute button. Just pulled up the list that has a breakdown pretty much of the sector, and certainly ticks all of the subsectors that you've been speaking about. Paul, can I ask you from an offshore procurement point of view, is there anything in that list that particularly stands out, or what are you seeing?
Well, particularly in the equipment space and the equipment availability space. And I'll give you a great case example. Multinational Indian headquartered business, Not Adani, with operations in India, brought an Australian consulting and operations group in to do some work for equipment optimisation. They had 15 Australians on the ground in India, and they did the same amount of work with a higher level of productivity, efficiency and safety that it took 330 local workers to do. Now, yes, there's a difference in salary, but even with that, that productivity factor alone was so huge that they're now changing the way they're doing things, and they're bringing in the lessons learnt from that that opportunity. I think the other area that, and we probably get criticised for it a lot, is the engineering space. There's a lot of criticism that Australian engineering is very expensive. Yes and no is probably the answer to that. We have a very high level of technical expertise in engineering in Australia, particularly in the mining sector. And we need to leverage that internationally. And customers will pay for that expertise because it means reduced hours overall for them and greater reduction in risk.
Thanks, Paul. So increased productivity, high degree of technical expertise, and leading to a reduction in risk and cost saving. Jeff, CSA Global is a services exporter. And a lot of people probably don't fully appreciate the size of the services export industry, not just in METS, but across the board. What's the level of opportunity, I guess, building on what Chris and Paul have just said, for companies such as your own?
There are huge opportunities, not only for companies like my own, but for the services sector generally. I think that it's a well-known fact that the way that countries do their accounting is based, GDP is really based around balance of payments, around products exported and imported. And so hugely impacted by commodities and manufactured goods, and the services industry is well under accounted. So it's the service sector is much bigger, and we know it's very large in export markets, in developing markets. So going back for companies like similar to my own or others in the MET sector, there's huge opportunities. But these opportunities can be limited or amplified depending on your relevant language and cultural experience and capability. For example, in developing markets, often the historical studies and work may not be in English and done to different standards as well. So if you're going to operate in that market, then you need to get that language availability in a technical, not just a translator, but in a technical capacity. Also understand what standards they've been operating to. The Chinese operate to Molar standard, the Russians to GKZ. There's different standards around the world, and often they're coming to the Western groups. In my field, the specific advantage is around the reputation Australia has got for developing compliance and reporting standards. So one of the first in the world to develop a code of reporting exploration results, resources and reserves, the JORC code, which has now been adopted globally in parallel with other codes from Canada and out of Europe and so on. So that's a specific advantage in my area, and I'm sure that there's other engineering standards and reporting codes and so on, which would be, of similar value to companies outside the direct area I work in.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. There's some good tips in there with regard to service-based export, understanding your market, doing your research, and doing what you need to differentiate and stand out. So, as we've been talking about, there's MET's opportunities globally in every corner. I've just got a slide there that looks at some priority markets with the greatest opportunity. Now, this is by no means a definitive list of where MET's opportunities currently exist, but I've just put that up as an indication of how widespread these opportunities are across the globe. Austmine every 2 years surveys the MET sector, and I'd urge you to log on to the Austmine website to have a look at some of the survey results. But from the survey in 2015, areas of the world that were most prominent, so 67% of respondents were supplying into Southeast Asia, 50% into Oceania and Antarctica, 42% into South America, 40% into North America, and 33% into sub-Saharan Africa. So all corners of the world. This is a question to everybody on the panel. Is there such a thing as an easy export market? Chris, your views on that?
No, absolutely not. There's not such a thing as an easy export market, but certainly markets sometimes closer to home are generally more accessible, particularly from a cost and travel point of view. So you might be able to be in those markets more often than not. And those markets might include areas like New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia. So for new exporters, they might like to consider those.
Thank you, Chris. Paul, do you have any comments there? Is there an easy one?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, even having done work in New Zealand is not an easy export market for Australian companies. You're always going to have cultural differences. You're always going to have different types and levels of competitors in those markets. And you're also going to have different levels of sophistication of customers in those markets.
Thanks, Paul.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're right, you go.
No, I was just going to say that from a cost perspective, yes, they're easier, just from the travel, etc., but you've really got to do your homework.
Jeff, any comments? Any easy markets in your eyes?
I agree. I agree with the other panellists that don't kid yourself that any market, both domestically or export, is easy. It'll come across as arrogance and it will bite you on the behind. So no, all good things comes to those that put in the effort, and prior performance prevents stuff as well. So what I'd say is when you're looking at export markets, the things that you should maybe steer clear of, or not necessarily steer clear, but you should consider is a risk-based approach. So there's international. Is there a trade ban on the country? Are you partially US affiliated, or are you going to have problems with banned countries on the US Treasury list? Which we've run into in Sudan. North Korea, Syria, Somalia, the like. Either from a sovereign risk point of view or a health and safety or terrorism risk point of view, they're going to be harder. And then capacity and capability considerations. Don't oversell to a market if you can't deliver operationally. Those things that I mentioned before about cultural knowledge and language ability to operate. Do you have the necessary licenses to operate in that country? Do you have the supply channels to be able to operate into that country?
Brilliant, thank you. So don't be complacent. Go in with your eyes wide open and put the appropriate amount of rigour into approaching a new market. I guess some key messages there. Again, this next slide isn't a definitive list of opportunities either, but just put that in there to show some of what's going on in a couple of those markets. I might not dwell on that. I'll just let you have a quick scan of that. But I want to move on to, so we've been talking about the more macro environment. I want to get down into the more enterprise level discussion, what this means for individual firms wishing to explore offshore opportunities. So export strategy. As the panelists have been talking about, it has to be a planned approach, a planned, well-considered approach. So if we're looking at exporters, I guess generally speaking, you can break it down into two groups: those that are new to export and those that have been doing it a while. If you look at the new exporters, now typically, this is a fairly rubbery figure, of course. It changes year to year, but every year there's probably 20% of exporters are relatively new to the export environment. And if you break them down, you can say that probably a quarter of those are what's termed born global. So these are companies that typically set out and they know they need to export within the first 2 years of startup. This is a combination of there not being enough critical mass in their customer base in Australia, or it might be that they've got a level of specialisation that they have to go out to a global marketplace. So just using an example that's not METS based, the gaming industry, a lot of development goes into developing electronic games, and it's just not the audience, there's not the market in Australia, once you've produced an Xbox game, whatever it might be. So companies like that set out with their R&D and their commercialisation of new products, knowing that they've got to go global quickly. The next category there is successful intenders. So these are companies that strategically plan to begin export. It may take them 2 years, it might take them 10 years, but it was always on their radar, and they've set about doing it. The last category there are accidental exporters. So these are companies that have got an export order that's, let's say, has kind of fallen in their lap a bit. Now, the export sale might have come to them through an existing network. They might have been referred by someone in the supply chain that they've worked in the domestic market with. Typically, though, the 50% of accidental exporters are least successful. They usually have the lowest export revenue, and they're more likely to be irregular exporters and opportunistic. So I guess the message there is plan for it. If you're looking to export, take a planned approach. Jeff, if I can ask you, you're a services company, and perhaps you tell us, has CSA been a born global company? To grow the business, did you need to look at offshore opportunities?
Yeah, look, I would classify us that we were born global. The mining industry just lends itself to that. Often the funds, the head office is in one country, the funds are coming from another country, and the project's in another country, and maybe the suppliers or the staff, are sourced from other countries. So it's just natural. for me, or for the met sector to sort of take more of a global approach. Even if you're not doing export marketing, your expertise ends up going to export markets, even if you're Perth-based and you're working with Perth-based clients. It's just the way it goes. We had a very clear focus. We decided we needed to, we had a strategy around diversification across regions, across the mining value chain and across commodities. To effect that, we needed to do a management buyout and bring a couple of branches of CSA Global, which were operating independently back in the day, to under one fold, so that they were an integrated company. And then we had a strategy to grow capability and capacity near key international centres of mining finance, because you've got to follow the money. So that's what we did.
Thanks, Jeff. So some very sound reasons to formulate the export strategy that CSA Global have quite successfully put in place. Chris, can I ask you, generally speaking, what are some other reasons that companies would consider export as part of their overarching strategy?
Well, first of all, I think companies are really looking to grow. And then they see a need in a market. Sometimes those needs are identified through research, and sometimes they come upon accidentally, or perhaps they're talking to another partner of theirs, and that partner points out the need to them. And then, Jeff mentioned this to them, is spreading risk. So we know from our members that during the downturn, those who exported did much better than those who didn't export. So export markets are an important way to spread the risk, particularly in an industry where we have a very boom-bust cycle.
Thanks, Chris. If I pull up these reasons to add to that, so profit increase, grow business, as Chris has said, increase competitiveness, economies of scale, spread risk, as we've been talking about, internal improvements, access to new products. So that's more so showcasing the new products and services that you might have, reducing costs, born global. Other ones to add there might be better capacity utilisation, even out fluctuations in demand, reduce the dependence on a domestic market. So I guess that links to what Chris had mentioned in the downturn. And extend the life of a mature product is an interesting one as well. So selling into a less mature market with a mature product can provide opportunity. Chris, can I just continue on with you based on that Austmine survey? Just talk very briefly about sources of opportunity. So this question, they were asked, the respondents were asked to rate the significance of a set of specified opportunities. And can you talk us through that second bar there, perhaps?
Well, that goes back to 2 years ago during the downturn when, people were really looking at how they're going to diversify their business, because business here in Australia, wasn't very good. And so already about 66% of MET's companies export, so that's a very high percentage indeed. And as you can see here, companies are looking to export even more.
Thanks, Chris. So let's just move on now to reasons why companies rule export out. They don't consider it, or they've considered it but put it in the too hard basket. Again, I'll pull up the next slide, which is some more of that Austmine research. Now, it's a bit hard to read that probably on your screen, but some of the key impediments there are lack of internal resources, high domestic cost base, lack of finance. Some people will comment that it's too risky. Chris, again, what's some of the evidence that sits behind that bit of research that you see? And what are companies looking for in order to help them get across the export line?
Well, I think it's really interesting that the number one impediment there is really most easily fixed given the range of programs and support that is out there. So whether it's through the Entrepreneurs Program, whether it's a program through Austrade, whether it's a webinar like this, or a mission that goes offshore, that is something that can be the most easily addressed, so we shouldn't let it be a barrier. The issue of the high domestic cost base, where 22% said that that's an impediment to export, that is certainly a barrier to overcome. But at the time we took the survey, the dollar was much higher. So looking at where the dollar is now, perhaps we would have gotten, a different result for that. And as you can see further down that graph, the high Australian dollar was indicated by 16% of those respondents. And then I guess just the other thing to mention is the lack of finance. We don't have really a banking sector in this country that's willing to take risks, particularly with METS companies, because they link them to the mining industry, and particularly offshore. So if you're looking for some debt funding, it's virtually non-existent, but of course we have people like EFIC that can help, and I think we'll be talking about that a bit later on.
Thanks, Chris. We'll definitely mention Export Finance Insurance Corporation later on the webinar with a link to their website. EFIC will often step in where your bank won't, and very instrumental in what we're talking about. Next, we're going to move into, so a company, let's say a company is considering export. As we've all been agreeing, they need to go on with their eyes wide open. So I've got a list here, and it's pretty comprehensive. I'm not going to go through it item by item, but essentially these are things that you look at with regard to assessing your export readiness. If I chose a couple of them to talk about, and I'll ask the panel to comment on these now as well. So certainly an integrated export domestic strategy. So not seeing your export business as a standalone to your domestic business is what that refers to. If we work down the list, an exportable product and service, so adapted to particular countries if required. Suitable export pricing is absolutely paramount, and I guess from my experience this is where I've seen a lot of businesses get into trouble, that they don't fully appreciate what's required in order to put a pricing strategy in place. To the panel, Paul, Jeff and Chris, from your experience, is there anything either missing from that list, or are there things on that list that you would draw particular attention to?
It's Jeff here. Thanks,
Jeff, yep.
Thanks for the question. I would say that probably the thing that we've experienced the most, and I'd urge everyone to listen or pay due attention to, is changes in local operating conditions or operating regulations and rules. If there's a change in government, the most clear example of that is in Indonesia, where the mining regulations and the enforcement of the new mining law was significantly different with the change to the current government, and it has made a big impact on the mining industry as a whole and the GDP of Indonesia. But it's happening in other places as well, such as the Philippines. So I'd say sovereign risk issues around government policy and so on can have a huge impact to a local market that you may have developed for a long time. But the other thing is the need for face-to-face meetings and personal relationships. Relationships take time to develop, particularly where there's cultural differences. You have to be committed and provide the time to allow them to develop. Reputation takes even longer to build, but both relationships and reputation can be easily destroyed by lack of service or cultural insensitivity.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff. Paul, do you have any comments on that list of export readiness points?
I think the other thing that probably isn't on there is understanding and having a good corporate governance framework in your business, because every jurisdiction has different requirements. You'll be dealing with different approaches to the treatment of facilitation payments, for example, depending on which country you're in. And you have to fully understand the requirements that if you're an Australian company or you have a US affiliate or a UK one, that some of the legislation applies globally, even if you don't think it applies in the country you're operating in.
Thanks, Paul. Chris, any comments on that list?
Yeah, I think two words are missing. One is leadership. While that kind of dovetails into the management commitment, you really need strong leadership who has a vision to drive your export business, particularly as it takes significant time and money to develop export markets. And the other one is focus. Jeff mentioned this before, that they had really a laser focus on their export business, and I think that's really important when you're developing exports, along with a clear strategy.
Yeah, they're brilliant. I'm sure we all know we've got companies. We've got CSA Global in the webinar now, but I'm sure we all know other companies that leadership factor has been absolutely crucial in charting the export direction. Just going to move on now to assessment. So identifying and assessing the opportunity. I'm conscious of time, so to keep moving along. But what we've done here is we've looked at the opportunity from three different angles. The commodity that you perhaps has some specialty in working with, the country that commodity exists in, and the customer who's going to pay for your products or services. I've added a couple of slides in here because often it's, if I mention those things, a lot of companies that haven't explored export opportunities in the past, the first thing that they'll often ask is where to get information from. How do you know about these things? I've dropped in a couple of slides that's got sorry, I don't have those slides in there, sorry. I was wanting to show you a couple of examples of market research reports. There's some very, very good market research available. Some of it's free, some of it you'll pay for. Some of it is available through industry associations and government departments. But doing some good sound desktop research is certainly a good starting point. If we talk briefly on commodity, so as you can see there, if you're looking at establishing where opportunities might lie, and you've been successful in working with a particular commodity in the domestic market, there's some of the considerations that you might consider. So location, major deposits, exploration dollars being spent. Then for specific projects, the detail that sits there around asset owner, asset managers, etc. Then of course looking at commodity forecasts and trends. Jeff, can I ask you, does CSA Global tend to focus on a particular commodity offshore, or are you working across the board?
No, we don't focus on a particular commodity across the board. We do work across the board, excuse me. But there are particular countries that are more endowed with particular deposit styles and minerals, and we'll target our capability around those commodities. If I go and use the Indonesian example, coal represents about 60 or 70% of their mining industry activity, and then the next largest is nickel laterite, and then you move into gold, copper, tin, etc. So it's really understanding that market that you're entering, knowing both what type of commodities, where is the biggest activity in the mining sector, by commodity type, if that's relevant to your thing. If you're operating, if you're providing processing skills, then it is likely that it will be very relevant. If you're providing mining expertise, maybe it's not that relevant. You need to know where are the large open cast mines compared to the small open cut mines, and where the underground mines are. So it's just really doing your research and not being too focused on any one attribute, or being focused on the attribute that matters to your products or services.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll move on now to, as part of the assessment and selection exercise, reviewing the country, the market where the opportunity exists. So as we've got there, with an overview of the market, the commodities, the projects, entry barriers and requirements, free trade agreements, channels to market, how you're going to supply to the particular market, infrastructure and logistics, degree of competition, commercial considerations in the business environment. Paul, can I call on you? Is there much variation between country when it comes to things like contract law and finance risk and some of that sort of stuff with regard to these sort of projects?
At a fundamental level, yes, there is. But I think some of the key things that always come up will always come up. Your limit of liability, performance guarantees, warranties, etc. You'll find differences between the common law system and codified system. The key things to look at, where there's free trade agreements, understand what those requirements are. Same time, look specifically tax treaties and whether they're included in the free trade agreements. And then also you need to think about what are the requirements for actually getting your money out of that country you're operating in. And that can vary quite significantly between country and country in terms of the process you have to go through. And that then affects your cash flow if you're repatriating income back to Australia.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just reiterate, as far as finding out this information, there's some very good country guides, industry guides. Certainly go onto the Austrade website and do some searches. The likes of PricewaterhouseCoopers and other large accountancy firms provide some excellent industry and market guides relevant to what we're talking about. So this information certainly exists, and I guess one of the key things that we're emphasising today is just the importance of being well researched. So zeroing this down in the assessment and selection exercise, we'll come to customer considerations. So when you look at that list around procurement, management structure, we've got culture, supply chain, product service adaptation, commercial considerations. I guess, there's not, most of those things are common regardless of whether the customers in Australia or overseas. The things that obviously stand out there are things like culture. The image there is a book that I used to use a lot with my export clients called Kiss, Bow or Shake Hands. And there are other books around, but essentially that book looked at how to do business in 60 countries, and it had a chapter on each country, and it drilled down into things like cultural expectations, all sorts of stuff that were relevant, that if you were flying to a particular country to have a meeting, reading that chapter relevant to that marketplace was well worth the time and effort. It went down into the degree of how they think, cognitive processing, all sorts of stuff. So if you see it in a bookshop, it's often in the discount bins. They can pick it up usually quite cheaply. It probably doesn't have a big audience, but well worth grabbing. Paul, how do Australian SMEs stack up against the overseas competitors when everybody's throwing their hat in the ring for a particular procurement opportunity, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, quite well, because you find that most of the customers they're pitching to in Australia have fairly high requirements, particularly from an international perspective. So it is a good training ground for exporters. I think the key differentiators are the regional, local and cultural issues and understanding how they need to be addressed in the value proposition. So if you're in Saudi Arabia, understanding the requirement for Saudiisation in terms of the number of Saudi nationals you need to employ. Similar issue in Indonesia around that. And a lot of Latin American countries have those requirements as well. the BEI indicators in South Africa. So it's understanding those particular cultural issues and the use of terminology and those little cultural nuances. You mentioned the accounting firms having a lot of doing business guides. Some of the international law firms do them as well, like Baker & McKenzie and Norton Rose Fulbright have doing business guides in pretty well, I think, 180 plus countries around the world, and they set out all those legal requirements, which will give you a good flavour of understanding what needs to be put into your thought process and your decision process.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to keep moving, conscious of the time. This slide just has been put there to identify the different market entry methods. Chris, could I get you to talk very briefly about the different ways that METS companies can enter a particular offshore market?
Thanks, Anthony. Well, most new exporters or most countries, when working in a new market, will initially work with an agent, distributor, or some type of partner, which you can see represented there on the yellow box. And this will really help with the learning curve, tap you into networks of contacts, and provide a base on the ground without making a significant investment. Then, of course, you can set up in the country, which will require more investment in your part, or you can service the market directly from Australia. But that can take a lot of time and effort if you have to travel back and forth.
Thanks, Chris. Just moving along, I just wanted to touch on trade missions because that has come up previously in our discussions. And that's a map of the Austmine's trade missions, and Austmine, certainly Austrade, run a number of METS trade missions each year as well. But just again to you, Chris, what's involved in a trade mission? If you can just give a snapshot very quickly of what participating companies can expect to gain from involvement in a trade mission.
Well, trade missions are usually about a week long and entail meetings with mining executives, visits to mine sites, and maybe a visit to an exhibition, and depending on the market and when you're in the market. They certainly open doors that are not accessible to individual companies, and they introduce you to new contact, and they provide insights that you wouldn't normally get. A lot of these insights are from the other participants themselves and the learnings which they share during the trade mission.
Brilliant, thank you. Just coming up to the end now, I just want to talk about export assistance, and there's just to go to one of the questions early on, Jenny has asked if we can provide a list of the law and accounting firms that have the doing business guide. So we'll endeavour to get a brief list of who is putting out those guides and some web links in the next couple of days. Austmine assistance there for Austmine's export assistance, as you can see there. Then I'll move on to Austrade. There's some links there. So there's an export guide, market research, offshore assistance, export grant, export market development grant is certainly worth looking at as well. You've got state government trade agencies, you've got the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation that we mentioned earlier on. Also, the Export Council of Australia has some good training courses available as well. Information sources, we've covered off on some of those. We're talking about accountancy firms and legal firms and whatnot, and so on there. Just quickly, final tips, because I want to grab a couple of questions that we've got there, at least one question. So final tips, a well-developed integrated strategy is essential. Make good use of the assistance and support available. You need to be in it to win it. Leverage your contacts in Australia and plan for the long term. The handout is a 10-question diagnostic that'll be downloadable from the Austmine website. We should probably have time for one question, and this question's from Ian. So if India is a growing market and have an appetite for Australian expertise and productivity, how do we combat and gain market share from incumbent competitors who operate on low margin and cost bases and reduced level of standards? I'll open that to the panel. How do we operate against competitors that perhaps are operating on much lower margins and cost bases? Jeff, do you have...
Yeah,
yep.
Sure. It's Jeff Elliott here from CSA Global. I think you've got to pick your fights that you think you can win. You know, there's no point trying to go into something that's labour intensive and in a third world country and trying to operate at the local price breaks. I think you've got to define your value proposition and focus your marketing strategy and business development strategy about delivering value. And so don't operate at, you know, look at the total price of the job, product that you're delivering, and focus on those clients or target sectors that need value and benchmark yourself appropriately so that you're not comparing apples and oranges. You're trying to say, well, if you want premium services or premium products, this is where what you've got to pay, and this is the client referrals we can give you, or the testimonials from our clients about our particular service or products. This is some of the QC, quality assurance and control that we put in place for after sales support. This is the types of warranties or guarantees and insurances and so on we can have. So just really, you know, inform your clients about the investment you've made in your product and why you think it's worth paying a differential for, because it's valuable.
Great, thanks, Jeff. We've got a couple more questions there, but unfortunately we've come to our hour, so we're out of time. Just a couple of things before we wrap up. So we've mentioned the Entrepreneurs Program. Certainly as it applies to companies considering export, a business evaluation might well be a good way to understand whether you should be factoring export into your strategy and whether you're ready to do that. So by all means, make contact and we'll discuss eligibility and what's involved with that. Just a map of where we're located as far as business advisors and facilities